What's on, ladies and gentlemen? My name's Ross, I like games, and today we need to take a little bit of a look at the Tide. That is a new mechanic which is coming to Keyforge in the new set, Dark Tidings. Now, we were told a little bit about this the other day, but FFG, the lovely folks who make the game, have gone and shown us a whole bunch of Tide-related cards. Seems like it would be rude if we didn't take a look at them. Now, we still haven't explicitly been told there aren't more Tide cards, but it looks like there is just the one Tide card. What it says in the article is that every Archon deck in Dark Tidings comes with the new Tide card, and it forms an integral part of many cards in the set. It starts out of play, but as soon as one player raises the Tide, it is brought into play with high Tide on your side, low Tide for your opponent. And then of course it gives a player with low Tide the option to take 3 chains and raise the Tide, and essentially it becomes a bit of a back and forth. Remember that chains are bad, they basically lead to you drawing fewer cards as you go through the game, but as we're going to see, there are a whole bunch of cards that like having high Tide, so it very much is worth taking the hit so that you can actually have high Tide on your turn. The question is really going to be whether you are willing to take those 3 chains, but as soon as your opponent isn't, you're going to be rolling. And do remember, if you're playing a Dark Tidings deck and your opponent isn't, they're not going to really gain any advantage from raising the Tide. They're just going to be slowing you down. That could give an advantage to Dark Tidings decks. Now, there are a few, so we are going to have to go through slightly quicker than maybe we normally would, but we'll circle back to some of these cards in the future. So, KIRI GILTSPINE is a free power creature with elusive. So, the first time you attack, nothing happens. You've got to attack twice. And after an enemy creature reaps, it does not ready during its controller's next ready card step. So, generally speaking, at the end of your turn, one of the things you would do is make all of your cards active. Yeah, if you reap and KIRI's on the field, gutted. You don't make yourself active, so essentially every time you reap, you might not have that creature next turn. Now do remember, if you reap with a Star Alliance creature, you don't ready yourself. If you don't then pick Star Alliance next turn, you will still ready yourself then, but it is really going to restrict your choice. If you reap with all your Star Alliance creatures, you're probably not going to be able to pick Star Alliance next turn, even if you'd otherwise want to. Now, the Chosen One is one of the very few cards we saw previously when this set was revealed. 9 power is very high, but instead of readying creatures they control during their ready card step, your opponent deals 1 amber to the Chosen One for each exhausted creature they control. So if they've got 4 exhausted creatures, none of them get readied, they just deal 4 damage to the Chosen One. The thing about this is they cannot just ready on their next turn, because this keeps happening. So if they've got 3 exhausted creatures, they deal 3 damage, but they don't get readied. And then at the end of their next turn, they deal 3 damage, but they don't get readied. So whereas we saw with KIRI that they don't get readied this time, but they will next time, the Chosen One could, if they've only got 1 or 2 creatures, it could be several turns before they're readied. Sleep with the Fishes, sticking with the new Unfathomable cards. Now, this isn't actually a Tide card, but we're chucking it in because, you know, it's in the article. Gives you an amber bonus, and it destroys each exhausted creature. But I've just shown you 2 cards in KIRI and the Chosen One that don't let your opponent ready exhausted creatures, which gives you 1 more turn to draw into or have the chance to play Sleep with the Fishes. This could be a phenomenal card. I mean, just generally, if your opponent uses 6 creatures and exhausts them, you can destroy them all while gaining an amber. But being able to keep them exhausted and then take them out, that's kind of dumb good. Couple more we do need to look at from the new Unfathomable house, HOOKMASTER. 4 power, 1 armor, and when you fight, if the Tide is high, your opponent loses 2 amber. So now we're really getting into the Tide portion of the video. This is phenomenal when the Tide is high. Making your opponent lose 2 amber is kind of nuts, especially if your opponent's got a 1 power creature on the field, so they don't deal any damage back to you, it just all gets blocked by the armor. But this is a kind of card where you're going to want to sometimes take the chains, because this is going to make your opponent lose amber, which is going to mean they're not able to forge a key, which means they're going to win the game one or more turns later. And if your opponent is taking an extra turn or more to win the game, opening the door for you to win the game, it's going to be worth taking some chains. And how about the wonderfully designed SEABRINGER KEKOA? A 7-power creature with taunt. That is to say, you cannot attack its neighbours, you have to attack it. So we see this a lot in Keyforge. Powerful creatures that don't do very much, but they've got taunt, so they essentially can protect the creatures either side. But when it's destroyed, you raise the tide. Remember, generally speaking, in order to raise the tide, you have to take 3 chains. SEABRINGER KEKOA here is allowing you to raise the tide without actually taking the chains. Now, there's a decent chance your opponent's going to go, ha ha ha, I'm not falling for that. Brilliant. Just attack a creature that's going to destroy it. And then you get to raise the tide anyway. This is a big advantage. Now, moving over into logos here, we've got ourselves Tide Warp. Now, this is an artifact that gives you an amber bonus when you play it. And at the start of your turn, if the tide is high, your opponent raises the tide. If the tide is low, you raise the tide. And this is a really, really interesting card for me, because it doesn't really do what you want it to do all the time. Now, ideally, what you really want is just a card that lets you raise the tide without taking chains. And this does, but what it really does is it flicks between the players. It guarantees that at the start of your turn, it swaps to your opponent. Or to you. It means that if your opponent pays 3 to raise the tide, or 3 chains, they will only have it for 1. And that, for me, is the best thing about this, incidentally. Your opponent takes 3 chains to raise the tide, but then it immediately comes back to you, but then it goes back to them, and then it goes back to you. It basically gives each player a turn with the tide. This is one of those cards that you're going to have to be really, really careful how you play it, because this could end up being really, really good, or you could end up giving a tide to your opponent. What I will say is, if you're playing a Dark Tidings deck and your opponent isn't, such that they're not really gaining an advantage from the tide being high, they're just taking advantages away from you, this is going to be awesome, because it means that there's no reason for your opponent to ever try and raise the tide, because you're just going to get it back and they're just going to be taking chains. Moving over into Sanctum, we've got MARSHAL EWER. Of course, we have been given a nice little example for each of the houses, because each of the houses can use the tide. It's not just unfathomable. 4 power, 2 armor, and when you play it or fight, you raise the tide. So again, what we've got here is, and we're going to see this is going to be a real back and forth. We're going to have some creatures that gain advantages from raising the tide, and there's going to be other creatures that just raise or lower the tide. And that's awesome. Because, again, here you might not be gaining anything, but you're stopping your opponent, and sometimes that might be enough. Happens when you play, and it happened when you fight. So you can essentially, if MARSHAL EWER can keep fighting weaker creatures, the 2 armor means you can take out a bunch of weaker creatures before being destroyed. You're going to essentially be able to raise the tide on every Sanctum turn without taking chains. That could be pretty good. Now, old Paddy, I'll be honest with you, I am completely and utterly in love with old Paddy. Old Paddy is amazing here. Old Paddy is an untamed creature, 5 power, no armor, and when you reap, you discard the bottom card of your deck. If the tide is high, you discard the bottom 3 cards of your deck. Why do you want to discard cards on the bottom of your deck? Because you play each creature discarded this way one at a time. And it does not say untamed creature, just creature. Literally just that. That's ridiculous, ladies and gentlemen. Absolutely ridiculous. You could be playing 3 extra creatures, and the real key here, the real advantage is you are not depleting your resources in your hand. You are playing creatures without having to lower your hand, which is nuts. and the other, without even having to have them in your hand. Though do be aware you might end up discarding non-creatures, which you would rather have later. Lieutenant VALMART, moving over into the Grand Star Alliance, is a 3-power 0-armor creature, and when you play, or fight, or reap, if the tide is high, keys cost +3 during your opponent's next turn. Now the wording on this is kind of confusing, but your opponent will not be able to essentially raise the tide for them to stop this. When you play or fight or reap, at that moment, if the tide is high, you increase the cost of keys by 3 during your opponent's next turn, and there's nothing they can really do about it. Yeah, increasing the cost of forging keys by 3 is awesome, and this is a play or fight or reap skill, so if you can keep the tide high with this on the field, you can keep rolling. Oh yeah, and this is a common card, so if this isn't limited to a certain number in your deck, you can have decks with 3 of these, reap with all of them, you gain 3 amber, and your opponent's keys cost +9 next turn. That will definitely be worth taking 3 chains. Now, Sea Urchin is a lovely card from Shadows. It's an aqua. Now, I really like this because we don't see many Shadows creatures that aren't from the same race. This kind of is, which is cool, although it is still a thief. 1 power, 0 armor with poison. That is to say, if it deals any damage, it will destroy the creature it's fighting. And when you play, you capture an amber. If the tide is high, you steal an amber instead. Capturing an amber is quite nice. It takes it away from your opponent, blah, 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 blah. However, you're a 1-power creature. Your opponent can just destroy it and take it back. That's not particularly cool. Stealing an amber, you get it. Your opponent doesn't get it. Yeah, that's cool. Stealing is awesome. It basically turns it into Urchin, which is awesome given that it is Sea Urchin. The tide does have to be high for it to be a real Urchin, but then again, you've also got poison, which means you're going to be able to take down a creature of any size, as long as you can go through the armor. Yep, I'm in on that. Now, LAERIE of the Lake is kind of a cool one. This is a Sanctum creature, 3 power, no armor. While the tide is high, each friendly creature gets +2 armor. Okay, that's kind of cool. Of course, this is just a permanent ability, which means on your opponent's turn, they will be able to lower the tide for you, raise it for them, and you will instantly lose the armor. So you can raise it on your turn, you gain the armor while you're fighting on your turn, that's good, but your opponent will be able to lower the tide for you, and then your armor instantly goes away for your opponent's turn. But remember those evil twin decks I was telling you about? How a bunch of the cards have evil twins? So there will be basically pairs of identical decks. And the only difference is that cards that can have an evil twin version will have an evil twin. Yeah, LAERIE of the Lake does. 3 power, 0 armor, but while the tide is high, LAERIE of the Lake only gets +5 armor. And bearing in mind, most of the creatures in Keyforge have 5 power or less, which basically means LAERIE of the Lake can fight any of them without being destroyed. But you will only get this in an evil twin deck. So somebody will have, Wossy's Bounty, and you will have Wossy's Bounty's evil twin, so they'll get LAERIE of the Lake, and you'll get evil twin LAERIE of the Lake. And the final ones we can look at here are from the Saurian Republic. Undagnathuss, a 12-power creature, but remember the Saurian Republic have the big beefy creatures. While the tide is low, Undagnathuss deals no damage while fighting, so kind of rubbish. But if the tide is high, you're just a 12-power creature. And remember that 12-power creatures and above generally have giant downside. Cards like Gargantodon don't deal much damage while fighting. Pterodactyl doesn't, this does. This is an actual 12-power creature, but only when the tide is high. Oh yeah, and there's an evil twin. Undagnathuss is a 12-power creature as an evil twin, and it can fight regardless. But while the tide is low, you double all damage dealt to Undagnathuss, which is to say, your opponent only needs to deal 6 damage to destroy it. but you still get a 12 power creature that on your turn deals 12 damage. Even if you don't raise the tide, you still get a 12 power creature. But it will be destroyed by a 6 power creature, etc. Lots of examples there, ladies and gentlemen, of the tide and how it works. And this makes me very excited for Dark Tidings. It makes it seem like if you play Dark Tidings against Dark Tidings, we're going to have a real back and forth here as to whether the tide is actually kept high or whether the tide is kept low. And that's kind of fun. It does make me wonder what's going to happen when you're against a non-Dark Tidings deck, when you can gain advantages by making the tide high, and all your opponent is doing is slowing you down. Are they going to take the free chains? If it's a Dark Tidings mirror match, i.e. both players playing Dark Tidings, then you are going to be able to essentially slow down your opponent while helping yourself. But if you're playing Call of the Archons, you're not gaining the advantage, you're just slowing down your opponent. It's going to be a very interesting back and forth. Now, just quickly before we finish here, I do want to give a quick shout out to the lovely Dominic Dabrowski, and you know that lovely dude has helped us out on videos in the past. Him and his team have actually gone to set up a Keyforge quiz in English, Polish, and Italian. Do you want to go and take part? You definitely should go and take part. There's going to be a link in the description. Go check out that quiz. I promise you, I'm going to be checking out that quiz. You should be too. But for now, ladies and gentlemen, I want to know what you think about the tide, about this whole mechanic, about all the cards that I've shown you. So let me know in the comment section, would you? Go nuts, be nice. And then make sure you like this video, subscribe to this channel, follow me on Twitter at the Wossy, where we talk Keyforge and a whole bunch of other games. And please do consider checking out patreon.com/PTCGradio, where you can support the channel, get some bonus podcasts and all kinds of fun stuff. But by far the most important thing as always, look after yourselves till next time, would ya? Thank you very much for watching. My name's Ross, and you've been watching Wossy Plays.